Hello, this is Abbott Austin, and continuing with the spirituality course I'm offering. Again, it's offered for those who are thinking about a vocation, but it's available to anyone who might find it useful. So here we're on class number 3. In class number 2, the previous class, we spoke about the abilities that we need in order to reach our goal, which is to enjoy God. And those abilities are virtues. So remember, the definition of virtue we're working with here is that a virtue is a steadily ready ability to do an act that is fulfilling, a steadily ready ability to do a fulfilling act. So remember that, and so if you want to know more about it, you can review the previous video. Now, I want to point out that this has to do with freedom. Okay, these abilities, these virtues. When we think about freedom, we can think about what works against our freedom. And here, what will first come to mind often, or what's especially emphasized in our culture, is that there are external constraints to our freedom. So there's things outside myself that hold me back from doing what I want to do. So an obvious example is, let's say you were imprisoned. You were locked up behind bars. Those bars become an external constraint holding you back. It might also be, though, something in the nature of I lack money, right? So I want to do something, but I lack money, so it's something external that constrains me, my want of money. All right, whatever it is, there are external constraints, and that's what we tend to think about in our present culture here. But we want to notice, and what's sometimes overlooked, is that there are also things that constrain us from within, internal constraints, if you will. And here, let me give some examples. Let's say you're nursing a grudge. Right, so you're holding on to anger, some grievance, right? If you do that, that can hold you back from being encouraging, right? You're so kind of having a grudge and sour and angry. You can't be encouraging and kind and encouraging to another person. So the constraints within yourself, you're nursing, you're attached to anger, and it's holding you back from doing an act that is fulfilling, encouraging another person on the way to salvation. Also, you can have an attachment to money. I just spoke about not having money as a constraint that's external, but my attachment to money is something within me, and that can hold me back, right? So that can hold me back from being generous because I'm so tightly holding on to my wealth. And then also consider the example of lust, and there where someone is attached to sexual gratification and the pleasures that go with that. So there, let's say a man is full of lust, has this attachment, and that what will that hold him back from seeing the dignity, the full dignity of another human being? Let's say it's some woman he finds attractive, right? He's unable to see the dignity of that person because his mind is so occupied by lustful thoughts of looking at her as an object rather than as a dignified human being. So that's holding him back from doing what's fulfilling, right? Which is the important part of that is to see the dignity of human beings, of another human being. So these are internal constraints. And notice then when we're working on the virtues, what we're trying to do is we're building up these abilities, right? So the ability to see the dignity of another human being, the ability to be generous, the ability to say an encouraging word to someone when they need it. All these fulfilling acts, the more we are able to do these fulfilling acts, the more free we become. So in growing in the virtues, what we're working on is growing in freedom, right? And overcoming especially these internal constraints that hold us back from doing what's fulfilling. All right, so the more virtuous we become, then the more able we are to walk that road that leads to the enjoyment of God. And so we have to remember that. The good thing is it's a very positive view. So what we're doing when we work on the virtues, it's very positive. It's a hope-filled, promising effort that we're up to. And then we can be all the more encouraged because we can grow in these abilities, these virtues, right? We can do this, and we can especially do it because God is going to help us. So we have the grace of God to help us in the growth of these virtues, right? So it's, again, very promising and a hope-filled approach. And I hope you sense that. Now, to build up the virtues, one of the things we need to do is to practice them, right? So as with other abilities, the way you become better at them is by practice. So if I want to become a better piano player, then I have to practice the piano. If I want to become a better basketball player, say I want to become better at shooting free throws, then I have to go to the free throw line and practice, keep shooting. And notice here that when you practice, you have to practice doing it correctly, right? So if I play the piano with the wrong posture, the wrong way with my hands positioned and so forth, then the more I do it, actually, it's not going to make me more able to play the piano well. It's actually going to hold me back. So as we practice these things, we got to practice doing them rightly. So for example, if you're going to grow in the virtue, the ability to be patient, you have to practice patience. And that means not just putting on an external show of not saying something angrily out of impatience, but internally too, working on the proper dispositions, the proper kind of poise within yourself to have patience. So you got to do it properly, not just for show. And here too, we can think about the Lord and what he says in the Gospel of Matthew. These are the famous passage we have read, or is read at the Mass on Ash Wednesday. And the Lord speaks of 3 righteous deeds, and he calls them righteous deeds, right? He wants us to do these. He expects that it's like it goes without saying. These are good things to do. We should do them, but he wants us to do them in the right way. So he speaks about prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, right? And so he says when you fast, don't go look gloomy and for people to see you, right? But rather hide that and fast. He's still saying you fast in a way that's pleasing to God, in that hidden way that pleases God where other people might not see. Do that. Or when you give alms, don't do it for show, to get praise for other people, but do it for the good of other people and ultimately for God's good pleasure, right? So do these things in the right way. When you pray, don't pray for show and make a big production out of it, but pray before God in sincerity of heart. Okay, so the more we do it and we do it rightly, then we grow in these abilities. So we have to do that. We have to practice. Do it. Even though sometimes it's difficult and it goes against the grain, right? So go back to that encouraging word. Sometimes you're in a bad mood and you don't want to say something encouraging. So it really takes an effort. Here some of the spiritual authors spoke of, in a way, you have to do violence to yourself, right? That can sound kind of horrible and scary, the way we use the term violence now. But what they meant is that you have to kind of do something that seems unnatural because our fallen human nature, not our true human nature, but the fallen experience of it, we have to go against the grain. And so sometimes to do the virtue thing, to practice doing virtue, you have to kind of go against the grain and kind of push yourself. So do that. But at the same time, remember that we need God's grace. And so pray for it. Ask the Lord for the graces you need to grow in the virtues. And especially as you struggle with one or other of them, bring that to God and ask the Lord for the graces to work on the virtue, or as it might be, work against the vice that's holding you back from the virtue. So it's worth remembering. Okay, now the virtue, the ability I want to focus on for the rest of this class is the ability to think of God correctly. So it's an intellectual virtue, it's perfecting our intellect, our mind, and the ability to think about God correctly. And this is very important. Now remember that in order to enjoy God, we have to know God. And I've said earlier that it's an experiential knowledge of God of sorts. It's not experiential in the sense of something you touch with your senses, but you experience with your mind, your intellect. So we need this experiential knowledge of God in order to enjoy God. And here we can think of things like, enjoying some food, right? To enjoy some food, you have to actually taste it, you have to experience it. And so we want to taste and see that the Lord is good with our minds, right? So that's what we're after. But if we're going to do that, we need to think correctly about God. So having this experiential knowledge of God is what we're after. And yes, it entails more than simply thinking correctly about God, but still it does necessarily entail thinking correctly about God. So we have to be able to do this if we're going to be able to have this experiential knowledge of God. Okay, so we got to think about God correctly. And the first thing to realize here is that our knowledge of God, and in turn our way of speaking about God, even when they're right, they are imperfect. That is to say, they are limited. So they're imperfect in the sense that they don't give a full, that is a perfect representation of who God is. Okay, so again, they can be correct and right, but still they're limited. or as traditionally has been said, they're imperfect. Imperfect here does not mean wrong, right? It just means they're limited. So our thinking, our ways of speaking about God are going to be limited. We have to realize that. So let me go through an example of this. This is one that St. Thomas Aquinas gives, or he outlines. I'll give a concrete example. Okay, so let's look at the statement, two statements. Okay, one is, suppose you have a human being named Alice, and we say about Alice that Alice is just. Okay, so she has the quality of being just. We don't use this language that much anymore, but it means righteous, right? The person is a just person. It means they think and they will and they act in ways that are right, as they should, right? And so this is a just person. Okay, so Alice is just. That's one statement. And then we can also say God is just. Now, that's a true statement. God is just. And let's suppose that Alice really is a just person, so that the statement is true as well, right? With human beings, they may or may not be just. But let's say Alice is in this example. So we have these two statements. Alice is just, God is just. They're both true, okay? But what I want to show is that there's an important limitation of what when we speak about God, of how this falls short of God. Okay, so with Alice, let's think about her first, because it's easier for us to know other human beings, another creature, than it is to know God, the Creator. Okay, when we say that Alice is just, what we're saying is that this quality of being just, justice, right, of having justice, we're saying that there's a subject, Alice, and that this quality of being just belongs to this subject. So what you see going on here in our thinking and in turn in our speaking is that we are composing, we're making a compound, a composite of two things, a subject and what's traditionally called a predicate. So what we're saying is there's this thing here and there's this quality, in this case being just, that belongs, adheres to this thing, Alice, this person. Okay, now there's a composite there, and what we want to note that there is also a composite, a compound, in Alice herself, right? So it's one thing to be Alice, that's the subject, but being just is something that is an attribute, a quality, a predicate that adheres in Alice's soul. Okay, and that's a compound. We know that, for example, in this case, it's kind of easy to know because it's possible for a human being not to be just. So that quality need not adhere into the subject, Alice, right? So they're two distinct things. They all exist in one being, Alice, but they're two distinct things, right? The subject and then this predicate. So the statement in our thinking about Alice being just is a composite thing, has a composite nature to it. And then Alice herself and her reality also has this composite nature. Okay, now we turn to God and we see where this falls short. So again, our way of speaking is implying, or at least is kind of making it out as if God is a subject and this quality of justice kind of adheres in God. That's not the case with God, right? It's true that in our way of thinking and speaking, we have this composite mode of signifying this, but in the reality, which is God, there is no composite nature. There's no parts in God. God is, with the traditional philosophical term for this, is God is simple, right? It doesn't really work well in usual English jargon, but this is what it means in philosophical and theological speech. When God is simple, it means God does not have parts. It's not like God has to make himself out of these different components. No, God simply is, right? In his perfect being, it just simply is, right? And so even when we talk about the Trinity as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and there being three in God, those persons are not parts, right? Very, very important. We don't believe that the persons of the Trinity are parts of God, and we'll talk about that in a later class. Okay, but God's nature is simple, not composite. So you see how this breaks down then, so to speak. God is just is a true statement, but it has a composite nature to it, this statement and way of thinking, whereas God, the reality we're signifying, does not have a composite nature. So it's imperfect. It's a true statement, but it's limited. It doesn't get at the nature of who God is and his utter simplicity, his pure and wonderful being. So we have to remember that. If we don't, what we can end up doing is we can attribute things that belong to creatures and that are found in our way of thinking and speaking to God, even though they don't. All right, so notice something else here, and this is something Aquinas points out. And this is, I don't know if I gave it, but the reference here is the Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 13, Article 1. And then this distinction I'm about to give now is found especially in the reply to Objection 2, for those who want to look it up. Okay, so God is just as a true statement, but it falls short of God not being composite, right? And then another thing we can say about God and justice is we can say, therefore, that God is justice itself. So we kind of try to get around to this composite implication, and we say God is simply justice itself. And that's true as well. But the problem there, the way that statement falls short, is that when we think about the quality of being just, justice itself, we think of that as a quality, some abstract quality that needs to then adhere or exist in some subject, right? But again, so what we're doing here with this quality doesn't really exist on its own, but it exists in a subject. But when we say God is justice itself, we don't mean God doesn't exist on his own, right? So there's the way it breaks down. The quality of being just, justice itself, in our grasping of it, does not exist on its own, but as a quality that adheres in something. But so when we say God is justice itself, where does that fall short? It falls short of attributing this existence to God. God's not simply some abstract quality, right? But God exists, his pure existence, utter existence. It's beyond the way creatures exist, so it's hard for us to talk about. Okay, so the main point here is, remember, our speaking and our thinking about God are limited, and we have to be mindful of that. Now, all of our thinking about God is based on creatures. That's what our minds grasp most kind of naturally, in a way. What most easily our minds grasp are other creatures, things that, especially things we come across with our senses. It's much easier for us to grasp those things. And so, so then what we do is we then form an idea of God based on that data, so to speak, based on the input, the information we get from creatures, and especially because we know creatures come from the Creator. And so whenever some agent makes something, produces something, it's going to bear some reflection to the maker, some likeness back to the maker. And so based on creatures, we can then we can draw out of the something about the creatures, something about the Creator. Okay? So creatures represent God in different ways, and they give us data, information by which to form a correct understanding of God. Now, with that understood, it's worth knowing two terms that have been used in the tradition, theological tradition here, about speaking about God, describing God, approaching God. Okay, and they are kataphatic and apophatic. Kataphatic and apophatic. Okay, kataphatic means that we're going to speak of God by saying how he is like creatures. Apophatic is when we speak about God by saying how he is not like creatures. Okay, so to give an example, I say something like this, which is a statement found in Scripture. God is light. God is light. Okay, so we're getting our ideas about light from the physical light, creaturely light that we encounter in our world. And so I was saying God is like that. God is like this light, right? And that we won't get into how, but God is like that. So that's an example of kataphatic, of approaching God, speaking about God in terms of what he is like. So it's kind of a positive thing, taking the likeness of creatures and using that to speak of God. Okay, but then we can also say God is darkness, right? And darkness is the absence of light. So what we're saying, in effect, is God is not light, or God is not creaturely light. Okay, and that's an example of apophatic. So we're denying something. We're saying the likeness, when we note how the likeness of creatures or some quality of creatures falls short, is not like God. God's so transcendent beyond that we say God is not that, right? And that's apophatic. So kataphatic, apophatic, they both are very useful and important, and we need them both. So again, it's not a matter of one being right or the other being wrong here. We're talking about statements that are both correct. God is light. God is also darkness. Okay, we can say both of them do this. Now, I want to give an example of a statement from St. Augustine that kind of uses both the apophatic mode and then the cataphatic mode. So this is from the Confessions of Augustine, and it's in Book 10 of Confessions, in chapter 6, section 8, or paragraph 8. He says this, he's speaking to God. What is it then that I love when I love you? Not bodily beauty, and not temporal glory, not the clear shining light, lovely as it is to our eyes, not the sweet melodies of many-moded songs, not the soft smell of flowers and ointments and perfumes, not manna and honey, not limbs made for the body's embrace. Not these do I love when I love my God. But then St. Augustine immediately goes on to say this, yet I do love a certain light, a certain voice, a certain odor, a certain food, a certain embrace when I love my God. And then he beautifully goes on to describe in what ways those things are like God. Okay, so he starts off with this apophatic, a list of kind of apophatic things. It's not this, not that we find in creation. But then he goes on and then says, but in a way, it is this, it is that, right? It's a beautiful way of speaking, and it's very useful as we try to think about God, having the cataphatic and the apophatic. So be aware of that. And then finally here, in our thinking about God, I want to use something that St. Thomas Aquinas says also in that same article, Article 13 of the first part of the Summa Theologiae. And this is especially said in Article 2 of that question. All right, or question 13, sorry, article, I think I messed it up. I'll write it in so you get the correct reference. Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas says, if you look at creatures, you can notice in creatures certain perfections. So here we're speaking about things like the beauty, wisdom, goodness, the truth, justice, love in persons, right? So all these are these attributes, these qualities we find in creatures are perfections, right? And so we can, especially in those things, we can attribute those things to God very usefully and insightfully, right? So God is beauty, God is justice, God is just, or God is beautiful, or God is wise, God is wisdom, right? All these sort of things we just talked about. But we can apply these things to God. Okay, I'll give some concrete examples here. So often people find, the sunrise is something very beautiful and pointing to God. So let's look at that. So in a sunrise, you see this beauty, and it's a perfection, right? Another example would be, to look at a human being and see the goodness in a human being, right? There's in every human being, even sinners, there's this tremendous goodness, but we see it more easily, of course, in those who are virtuous. But still, we can see in a human being goodness. So we can say God is beauty, and our understanding of beauty is informed by things like the sunrise. Or we say God is good, and our understanding of goodness is informed by the good person, right? Or the goodness in a person that we see. Okay, and so that's legitimate to do that, right? And so there, the first step, as it were, in thinking about God is to see how creatures bear a likeness to God. They represent God. Okay, that's the first thing, this likeness that creatures have to God. To acknowledge that and to use that to speak about God and to talk of God's perfections, His goodness, His beauty, and so on. All right, but then the second step, as it were, is to say, but those creatures do not perfectly represent God. Okay, their likeness falls short of God, right? So the beauty of the sunrise, as wonderful as it is, falls short of the beauty of God. The goodness of another human being, or my own myself as a human being, right? That goodness falls short of God's goodness. So what's going on? So in the first step, it's a cataphatic move, right? And in the second step here, sometimes this would be called remotion. It doesn't really work in contemporary English, but remotion. It's a negation, right? So it's an apophatic move. So we first acknowledge the likeness of creatures to God, especially in these perfections like goodness, justice, wisdom, beauty, truth, right? But then we deny that those qualities in creatures are perfect representations of God. They don't. They fall short. So that's the apophatic move. And we have this denial. So where does that leave us? So we have the two. And what Aquinas does, it's very useful, and I think it's very useful in our spiritual life for a reason I'll say in a moment, is that what he's going to do here, he's going to say that we can go a third step, right? So we want to say that God is goodness. So we don't leave by saying, well, God's not that goodness. We still are saying God is good, but how are we saying that about God? What we're saying is God has this goodness in its perfect, preeminent way, right? So God is the cause of the goodness in this human being. And so God has this goodness preeminently, infinitely. And our minds can't grasp that, but we know that God is the source of this goodness, the infinite source of the goodness in this human being. So our minds then can point to, our thoughts can point to God as that infinite source of goodness. Likewise with the beauty of the sunrise. God has that beauty in infinite form as the infinite, uncreated source of the beauty in the sunrise, or wherever else we see it. So our mind then is, and our thoughts, they can point to God in this preeminent mode, transcendent, above all things, and direct our gaze in a way to it, even though we can't grasp that infinite goodness or that infinite beauty and so on. But our minds can then say God has this preeminently as the preeminent source of goodness, beauty, and so on in creation. And what this does, it allows our mind to kind of cast itself out there to the beyond, above all things, above anything you can think of, right? Our minds go way up into that, into the abyss in a way, into the darkness, if you will, right? And then what can happen? And then our love can follow in a way. We can direct our love to this, to where our thoughts point. As Aquinas says elsewhere, is in a way here, then our love can actually outstrip our thinking, because our thinking is pointing to it, but our love kind of goes all the way out there and can reach it. So this is very important for the spiritual life, and we need to do this. So to close, remember here that there's a right way of thinking about God, and that even when our thinking about God is correct, though, it's limited, right? So we don't have in this life a direct apprehension of God. We don't have a sight of God. That's for the next life. We see God face to face as he is, right? It's amazing to think about, but we will have that in heaven. But in this life, as profound as our ideas about God are, and sometimes it can be really profound and insightful, they always fall short of who God is, right? Our ideas about God never offer us a full, perfect representation of who God is. So we want to remember that and be a certain humility with our thinking. But again, it also allows us to remember that our thoughts, when they're right about God, they point us to the beyond, to God and his infinite goodness and his wisdom and so forth. And that allows our heart and our souls to reach out in love to God and to direct ourselves correctly on this journey that we're in to ultimately attain God and to enjoy him.